Okay, well, the subject tonight, a highly controversial subject, I always like to do those, is deciding when to overhaul. Um, and by the way, besides all of those other things, Charlie, that you said about me, I'm also a fast team rep, and my fast team program manager told me that she was going to be participating or attending the webinar tonight. So I hope I don't get myself in too much trouble.
Yeah, I'm one of,
Anyway,
I'm one of those too, Mike, and we better not get in trouble. I hope we're doing this right.
That's right. So, but you know how I work, Charlie. How are you going to know where the edge of the envelope is unless you explore it? So
that's why you test.
Right. At any rate, we're going to be talking about when to overhaul. I have some pretty strong feelings on that subject. And as those of you who have been reading my articles and attending these webinars know, I'm not a real big fan of the TBO concept. We'll talk about why, and then we'll talk about the way I manage the maintenance of my engines and the maintenance of the engines of the 300 or so aircraft whose maintenance my company manages right now. A lot of stuff that we're going to be talking about tonight, so let's get rolling. And let me just start off talking about the concept of TBO. As far as I'm concerned, and I will explain why I feel this way, the whole notion of engine TBOs is a thoroughly discredited concept, and one that has cost aircraft owners hundreds of millions of dollars over the years by causing perfectly healthy engines to be euthanized arbitrarily at some specific number of hours or some specific number of years. I say this is a thoroughly discredited concept because all of the data, and I'll get into some of that, suggests that it's a bad idea. The airlines stopped overhauling engines at TBO in the 1960s. The military stopped doing it in the 1970s. Pretty much the only segment of aviation that still does this stuff is at the low end of the aviation food chain where most of us hang out, owner-flown piston GA. And in my opinion, we shouldn't be doing it either. And so that's one of the reasons that I do these webinars and I write the articles, because I would like to try to drag piston GA maintenance kicking and screaming into the 21st century. And for the most part, presently it's sitting at about 1950. So we're going to try to do something about that. Let me tell you why I think overhauling a TBO makes no sense. TBOs, as they are presently published by engine manufacturers like Continental and Lycoming, are based on time and service. They're based on time and service in terms of engine hours and also in terms of calendar years. The problem with this is the time and service is not what determines engine longevity. It has very little to do with engine longevity. I have about an hour and 15-minute presentation that I give at AirVenture for the last quite a few years called To TBO and Beyond. It goes into a lot of detail about exactly what it is that determines how long our engines last. And there are a number of factors, but it turns out that hours and years are not among them. The primary factors that limit the life of a piston aircraft engine are really two. The first one is corrosion. The primary reason that aircraft engines don't make it to TBO is not because they wear out. We never wear these engines out. It's because they rust out. And they rust out because a lot of owner-flown aircraft are used irregularly and spend a lot of time sitting. And if they spend time sitting in a high corrosive environment, like, for example, where my airplane is based in Santa Maria, which is 8 miles from the Pacific Ocean, if they spend much time sitting and not flying, and the protective oil film gets a chance to strip off some of the critical ferrous metal parts, like cams, those things will start to rust. And we lose a lot of engines that way. That's probably the primary life-limiting factor in piston general aviation engines. And it is a factor that affects primarily owner-flown airplanes, not working airplanes, because owner-flown airplanes tend to fly irregularly. The second thing that limits engine life are various forms of operator abuse, things like cold starts without a proper preheat, failing to observe proper cylinder head temperature limits, and I've gone into that in great detail in our the leaning webinar that I did not too long ago, and so on. But those are the things that primarily determine the useful life of our engines, not some arbitrary number of hours or arbitrary number of years. One of the big problems with manufacturers' specified TBOs are that they're one-size-fits-all numbers. And if you think about it, it really doesn't make any sense to say that all engines should have the same TBO. Does it make any sense to use the same TBO for an airplane tied down outdoors in Tampa, Florida, which is probably the highest corrosion risk environment in the United States, with the possible exception of Puerto Rico, or one that's hangared in Tucson, Arizona, where engines can sit for decades without corroding? That's why they put the boneyards there. Does it make any sense to use the same TBO for an airplane that flies 400 hours a year on long trips as one that flies 40 hours a year, mostly on VFR weekend days for $100 hamburgers? It doesn't make any sense. The way the airplane is used and the risks to which it is exposed, both operational and environmental, have a gigantic impact on the useful life of the engine. And yet published TBOs take none of that into account. The whole notion of a TBO is predicated on this this concept. What I'm showing here is a risk curve, a conditional probability of failure curve. And the curve purports to depict the risk of engine failure as a function of engine age. And the concept that TBOs were predicated upon was that the curve looks something like this. That the engine is fairly reliable, not perfectly reliable, but quite reliable for some period of time that's called a useful life. But then if you run it long enough, it gets into what is called a wear-out zone, in which the probability of failure starts to increase. And if you run it long enough, the probability of failure increases to an unacceptable level. So the whole concept of TBOs is to voluntarily take the engine out of service before it gets to the end of its useful life and into the wear-out zone. Problem is that the risk curve for our engines doesn't look anything like this curve. The risk curve for our engines looks more like this. There are two high-risk areas of an engine. One is when it's young, and the other is when it's old. The risks of failure when it's young are called infant mortality failures. And the risk of failures when it's old are called wear-out failures. And then there's a period in between the infant mortality zone and the wear-out zone where the engine tends to be quite reliable. So the question is, what does the shape of this curve actually look like on the left side and on the right side? Because if the engine reaches a certain age and you're concerned that it may be approaching the wear-out zone, and so you decide that you're going to overhaul it in order to avoid getting into that wear-out zone, what you're doing by overhauling it is putting yourself right back into the infant mortality zone where the risk is high. So the question is, which is the worst threat? Is the worst threat in terms of risk of having an engine failure accident on the left side of the curve, where infant mortality risk is high, or on the right side of the curve, where the wear-out risk is high? Now, let me tell you right off the bat that I don't know exactly what the shape of this curve is. In fact, nobody knows what the shape of this curve is. Continental doesn't know, Lycoming doesn't know, nobody knows. We have a bunch of data that can give us some clues about what the shape of this curve looks like. In fact, we have a lot of information about what the left side of the curve looks like, and it's not very pretty, and I'm about to show you that data. We have only a very limited amount of data about what the right side of the curve looks like. And the reason we don't have much data is because most engines in the current maintenance philosophy that is used in general aviation are euthanized at TBO. So we don't get very many data points on engines way out at the right side of the curve. Now, I'm generating some data out there. My airplane engines are at 200% of TBO, and I'm still very happy with those engines, or relatively happy. We'll talk about that a little later. But there aren't very many people like me that are generating data way out on the right side of the curve. So we don't really know a lot about what the right side of that curve looks like. I'll tell you what we do know, but it's not a lot. And the reason is because the current maintenance culture prohibits people, or doesn't prohibit it, but discourages people from operating their engines out there. And so it's very hard to gather good data. Let me tell you the best data we do have. The best data that I've found comes from a study that was done in 2007 by a friend of mine by the name of Nathan Ulrich. He's a PhD reliability engineer who happens to have a passing interest in this stuff because he's also a Bonanza owner. And Nathan, back in 2007, ran a very interesting study of NTSB accident data for a 5-year period from 2001 to 2005. And what he did was he went through the NTSB database and selected out all of the accidents over that 5-year period involving small piston-powered general aviation airplanes where the NTSB attributed the accident to engine failure, either as the probable cause or a contributing factor. From that population of accidents, he excluded air race airplanes and agricultural application airplanes in order to try to get some data that represents how most sane people operate their airplanes. And here was the result of his study, and it's really quite interesting. This histogram shows the number of accidents that happened, engine failure accidents, that happened in that 5-year period as a function of time since overhaul in hours, where each of the bars in the histogram represent a 500-hour period. And you'll notice what a shockingly large number of accidents occurred in the first 500 hours after the engine was built or rebuilt or overhauled. And that each 500-hour period after that, the number of engine failure accidents go down. Now, let me make a comment here, and I'll make it again in a minute. There were almost no accidents at all, actually one, for example, in the 2,500 to 3,000 hour range. That shouldn't surprise anybody because most engines are not allowed to run that far. We euthanize our engines at TBO, and typical TBOs are in the 1,500 to 2,000 hour range. So there aren't a lot of us, I mean, I'm an exception to that rule, but there aren't a lot of us who are flying way out there on the right side. So it shouldn't be a big surprise that there aren't a lot of accidents out there. The thing that I think is really surprising, well, it's not that surprising to me, but I think it would be surprising to most people, is how very likely you are to have a catastrophic engine failure shortly after the engine is built, rebuilt, or overhauled. The most likely time for you to fall out of the sky because of an engine failure is in the first couple of 100 hours after the engine is built, rebuilt, or overhauled. Nathan's study also took a look at what this curve looks like, or what the catastrophic engine failure rates are, as a function of calendar years since overhaul, because both Continental and Lycoming presently recommend overhauls at 12 calendar years, regardless of engine hours. And the shape of the curve is even more striking when you look at calendar years. The overwhelming majority of catastrophic engine failure accidents occur in the first 4 years after the engine was built, rebuilt, or overhauled. In fact, I think if we broke it down further, you'd find that the overwhelming number occurred in the first year. So we have to be a little careful in evaluating this data. We have to understand that it can't tell us a whole lot about the shape of the right side of the risk curve, the wear-out zone part, simply because engines are so frequently euthanized before they get there that we don't have a lot of data. This is what's called in the reliability-centered maintenance literature, it's called the Reznikov conundrum, which is basically saying that the data we really want to have is data we typically can't get because the maintenance culture prohibits us from getting it because it doesn't allow people to operate out there. On the other hand, this data tells us a great deal about the shape of the left side of the risk curve, the infant mortality side. And I hope you find it eye-opening just how big that risk is. So if you've got an engine that's got some time on it and you're thinking about maybe overhauling it, you ought to think really carefully about the fact that doing that is going to put you right into the zone where you're most likely to fall out of the sky. Most people don't really think about that, but the data is very, very clear that if you're going to fall out of the sky with a catastrophic engine failure, the overwhelming likelihood is that it's going to happen with a low-time engine, not a high-time engine. What we can say with certainty is that the risk of catastrophic in-flight failure is very high when the engine is young and declines pretty rapidly as the engine gets older. And that from the data that's available, and we wish we had more, but from the data that's available, there is no evidence that the wear-out zone begins anywhere near published TBOs. In fact, there's a good deal of evidence that the wear-out zone probably doesn't start to exist until much, much more than published TBO, probably twice published TBO, for all but the highest risk engines. And the highest risk engines are those that are exposed to corrosion or those that are exposed to abuse. And those engines are not particularly likely to even make it to TBO. But the average engine, given a chance, is very likely to go way beyond TBO without any problem whatsoever. You know, it's interesting that this stuff is a special case of a general principle that was first documented in about 1941. I wrote an article in EAA Sport Aviation. I think it was in 2010 sometime that it ran, called the Waddington Effect, that talked about some top secret research that went on during World War II, in which a scientist by the name of C.H. Waddington was pressed into service by the Royal Air Force to start to do analysis on the maintenance of their B-24 Liberators that were supposed to be killing German subs, and they had a fleet of these sub killers that were spending more than half their time in the shop, and they brought in some scientists led by this guy Waddington to try to figure out why they were such hanger queens, why they were spending so much time in the shop, and why they weren't able to be out there killing German subs. It was basically what we today would call a force readiness study. And one of the things that Waddington's team, they gathered just tons of data and started crunching through it. And one of the things they discovered is that when they plotted the number of unscheduled maintenance problems with these airplanes as a function of how many hours it had been since the last scheduled maintenance, that they were At that time, they were putting these airplanes in the shop every 50 hours for scheduled preventive maintenance. And when they studied the number of unscheduled repairs required to these airplanes as a function of how many hours since the last 50-hour maintenance cycle, they discovered that the further away from that maintenance cycle you were, the more reliable the airplanes were. In other words, the number of failures kept going down and down and down, and never did tick up by the time it reached the next 50 hours. And you know what they reasoned from that is that it was the preventive maintenance that was breaking the airplanes. So what they convinced the Royal Air Force to do, and the maintenance people were very upset about this because it contradicted everything they'd ever believed about maintenance, was they said, hey, you're doing way too much preventive maintenance on these airplanes. Stop doing it. And they changed the recurrent cycle from 50 hours to 100 hours, and they quit doing a whole bunch of preventive maintenance that they'd been doing before, and only did the preventive maintenance that was proven to actually improve reliability. And they increased the force readiness of these B-24s by about 60% by doing less maintenance on them. And all of this stuff was classified and didn't become public until the late 70s. But the research was done in the early 40s, and it was spot on. The maintenance was hurting these airplanes more than it was helping them, and that's something that we see all the time. We call them maintenance-induced failures. In the early 60s, those principles were rediscovered at United by work that was done at United Airlines. The United Airlines guys had no idea about the stuff that was done in the 40s because it was still classified. But they crunched a whole lot of data at United Airlines in the 60s, right when they were changing over from the big recips to the first jets, DC-8s in the case of United, and concluded exactly the same thing, that that it was the preventive maintenance that was being done to these airplanes that was causing them to be unreliable. And the less preventive maintenance they did, the more reliable the airplanes became. And as a result, this became the way that maintenance was done in the entire air transport industry, starting in the late 60s. Most of the overhaul and replacement intervals were done away with. They don't do things with TBOs and life limits anymore, with very few exceptions. And the vast majority of maintenance went from being done on a timetable to done on condition, particularly on engines. They simply don't overhaul engines at any particular TBO anymore. They do it all on condition. And the result was a dramatic, huge increase in reliability and decrease in maintenance costs. And the airlines have been doing this since the 60s. The military has been doing it since the 70s. And the only guys left doing it the old-fashioned way is us, owner-flown piston GA. Maintaining on condition is the smart and the cost-effective way to do maintenance. We use a whole toolkit of available condition monitoring tools to monitor the condition of the engine, and then we let the engine tell us when it's time to do maintenance on it. Now, the FAA regulations permit Part 91 GA operators to do that. Manufacturers' TBOs are not compulsory for Part 91 operators. We can run the engines as long as we want. But very few operators do this. Very few mechanics believe in it. They still believe in the old TBO concept that the rest of aviation gave up, half of a decade ago. But we're still doing it. One of the neat things is that we have some really fantastic tools available in order to determine the condition of our engines. In fact, the tools that we have today are vastly more powerful than the tools we had, say, 20 or 30 years ago when I started getting first getting interested in maintenance. And let me just run down some of the most important ones. Oil filter visual inspection. Obviously, at every oil change, we cut open the filter and inspect it visually for metal. We'll talk a little bit about what we look for and how much is too much and so on. But now we have the ability to send that filter into a lab and have them putting it under a scanning electron microscope and come back to us and tell us exactly what the metal is, what kind of alloy it is, what the shape and size of the particles are. And from that kind of information, we can very frequently tell exactly where inside the engine that metal is coming from. Now, scanning electron microscopy sounds pretty scary, but it really isn't. It costs about $100 to have a filter analyzed. Now, we don't send every filter in for SEM analysis, but if we see more metal in the filter than we're comfortable with, we will typically send it into the lab and find out exactly what that metal is. Very few shops do that, but we do that anytime we're concerned about oil filter contents. Spectrographic oil analysis, where we send oil samples into the lab. That's something that was not very common 20 years ago. Nowadays, a lot of people do it. Every single one of the aircraft that we manage is on a spectrographic oil analysis program. It's a very, very powerful tool, but it has its limitations, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Another thing that has become very, very important in recent years is digital engine monitor data analysis. Nowadays, a lot of GA aircraft, including virtually all the ones that my company manages, are equipped with some kind of a digital engine monitor. And the data from the digital engine monitor gives us invaluable information about exactly what the engine is doing, how it's being operated, and whether it has any flaws in the hot section, if you will, in the power assemblies. I did a whole webinar on this subject. It's on the EAA website on digital engine data monitor analysis. And if you're interested, you might want to review that webinar, the recording of that webinar. Another thing that we didn't used to do 20 years ago, and we do extensively now, is the use of the borescope. Continental started requiring borescope inspections back in 2003, so about 8 years ago. And nowadays, most but not all GA engine shops, GA maintenance shops, have a borescope. Now, we still have a big problem because an awful lot of the mechanics don't know what they're looking for under the borescope. And I did another webinar that's in the EAA archives here called All About Cylinders, in which, among other things, there are lots and lots of borescope images so that you can learn what a good valve looks like versus a bad valve, and how you can tell whether the cylinder barrel has abnormal wear or not, and so on. And if you review that webinar, you'll know more than about 98% of all A&P mechanics about how to evaluate images under the borescope. But the borescope is a hugely powerful tool that we have, and we didn't used to do that 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. The borescopes were primarily something that were used on turbine engines, and they were very expensive. They were $10,000, $20,000 devices. So most piston shops didn't have them. Nowadays, you can get a good borescope for under $1,000, and every shop should have one. And in fact, it's the kind of thing that is not unreasonable for an aircraft owner to purchase for himself. The differential compression leak test, which has been around since Orville and Wilbur, I think, written into the regulations. We have to do it at every annual, but it's really not a very good test for reasons that I'll talk about in a minute. But it is one of the tools in our arsenal. Visual inspection of non-ferrous castings like the crankcase and cylinder heads. And if we see something that looks suspicious, a dye penetrant inspection to verify whether the cracks are there. It's very important to do a dye pen inspection because a lot of things that look like cracks aren't, and yet occasionally there'll be a crack that's very, very hard to detect visually, but is really, really obvious under dye pen. I'll show you a couple of pictures of that before we're done. And finally, trend analysis of oil consumption rates and oil pressure. All of these things used together will give us a very, very complete picture of the health of the engine, and will give us lots and lots of warning if something is starting to go bad that requires some sort of significant maintenance. Now, we have all these tools, but it's really important that we use all of them. The minute you abandon the notion of TBO and go to an on-condition maintenance program, you're basically accepting an obligation to use all of the condition monitoring tools available. And an awful lot of shops and mechanics don't do that. It's very important to put the engine on the most comprehensive condition monitoring program possible. If we use all of the available tools that I just talked about, we can be confident that we have a reliable assessment of engine condition, and that if anything is going wrong, we'll know about it in plenty of time. But if we fail to use all available tools, then we might miss something important. Here are some of the limitations of some of these things and why we need to use multiple tools. Oil analysis, for example, there's a misconception that a lot of people have that oil analysis is a substitute for oil filter inspection. Nothing could be further from the truth. Oil analysis is a supplement to oil filter inspection, but definitely not a substitute for it. And that's because oil analysis is something that detects microscopic wear metal particles in the oil. Particles that are so small that they go right through the oil filter and aren't caught, and are so small that they're invisible to the naked eye. That's why we do oil analysis, to detect whether there are microscopic wear metal particles in the oil. Oil filter inspection we do to see if there is big stuff floating around in the oil. Metal particles that are large enough to be caught by the filter and large enough to be seen by the human eye. Anything smaller than about 20 microns is going to pass right through the filter. And the only way we'll know about it is from oil analysis. The stuff we typically see in the filter are particles that are on the order of 100 microns or larger. And those will never show up in oil analysis because they get caught in the filter and don't wind up in the bottle. So I've heard people, for example, say, well, I don't believe in oil analysis. I had a friend whose engine blew up because it had a spun bearing, and the oil analysis never showed anything. Well, that just shows a fundamental misunderstanding of how these tools work. Any kind of a wear event that is rapid and throws off big chunks of metal, like, say, a cam lobe coming apart or a bearing coming apart, that metal is going to get caught in the filter. It's never going to wind up in the bottle. You'll never see it in oil analysis. You will see it when you cut open the filter. On the other hand, slow wear events, say the accelerated wear of an exhaust valve guide, throws off little tiny microscopic particles that you'll never see in the filter, and the only way you're going to know about it is through oil analysis. So you got to do both to get a complete picture. Then there's the case of what happens when oil shows up in the oil filter. You see, I mean, not oil filter, metal shows up in the oil filter. You look in the oil filter, a mechanic sees some metal in there, but mechanics are very, very poor at trying to figure out what kind of metal it is and where it came from. The only really good way to do that is to send the filter media into a lab and have them put it under a scanning electron microscope and determine precisely what kind of metal is in there so that we know where it came from. We had a case just a couple of weeks ago that really distressed me. One of the airplanes that we manage went into the shop for just a routine oil change. Mechanic cut open the oil filter and found a bunch of metal in it. He put a magnet on it and decided it was ferrous metal, and he talked to the owner and didn't consult with us, and the owner and said, I want to pull some cylinders. And the owner approved this. Now, our owners are taught never to do that. They're supposed to always talk to us first. But this owner screwed up and he didn't. And before we found out about this mechanic had pulled a couple of cylinders off this engine. Now, we couldn't find anything wrong with the cylinders, but in abundance of caution, he sent them out to the cylinder shop. And he couldn't find out anything wrong with the cam lobes that he was now able to see with the cylinders off. And then finally, we found out about it. And we said, wait a minute. Stop taking this engine apart. You know, let's figure out what was in the filter. So we had the filter sent to a lab. And 2 days later, we got the report back. And what did the report say? The report said that the metal in the filter was largely bearing material. It was thousands of flakes of bearing material. And it wasn't ferrous at all. It had a little bit of ferrous backing on it, which is why the mechanic jumped to the conclusion that it was ferrous and started pulling cylinders off. But it was very clear from the lab report that it had nothing to do with cylinders. So this is pretty serious. And the first thing we did was we had the mechanic pull the rocker covers and take a look at the rocker shafts, because that's one place where bearing material, bushing material can come from. They all looked normal. That was about a half-hour job. We had him pull a starter adapter and verify that it looked normal, which it did. And at that point, we made a decision that it had to be a bearing, a main bearing. And we had the engine pulled and sent for teardown inspection, and sure enough, one of the main bearings was starting to spin. But, I mean, this illustrated the fact that you look at an oil filter, and if you see a significant amount of metal, you have to send it to the lab to find out what kind of metal it is. Otherwise, you're operating blind. And in my experience, very, very few shops will send an oil filter out for laboratory analysis. But it's a very powerful tool and something that we always want to do. Anytime we see an amount of metal in the filter that is of concern, we always send the filter out for laboratory analysis under scanning electron microscope. Talk a little bit about compression tests. The compression test, which is a very old test, and it's written right into the regs so that we have to do it at every annual inspection, but it's a highly unreliable measure of cylinder condition. It was the best we had decades ago. Nowadays, we have much better tools. And the compression test, although it's required by regulation, is somewhat deprecated. There have been thousands and thousands of cylinders pulled unnecessarily based purely on compression ratings. And the compression test has so many false positives that it has cost aircraft owners just a huge amount of money pulling cylinders that didn't need to be pulled. The borescope, which Continental now has required for the last 8 years, the borescope is a much better method of determining cylinder condition. I consider it the gold standard. If a cylinder has low compression, we always do a borescope inspection of that cylinder. In fact, on our airplanes, we always do a borescope inspection irrespective of compression. And if the cylinder has low compression below the rejection threshold, but if it looks okay under the borescope, in other words, there's no obvious reason for the low compression, if it's a Continental engine, Continental's service bulletin SBO 3-3, which is probably the best thing that's ever been written on this subject, says don't pull the cylinder. Go fly the airplane for at least 45 minutes and then recheck the compression. We had a cylinder a week ago that measured 38/80 during a hot compression test. We had the shop borescope the cylinder. They couldn't find anything wrong with it. We said finish up the annual, button it up, and let the owner fly it for a while. We'll recheck the cylinder. The shop wasn't real excited about that. They said, how are we going to sign off the annual with a cylinder at 38/80? We said simple. Cite Continental Service Bulletin SBO 3-3, and that's exactly what that service bulletin says to do. If you can't find a problem under the borescope, then go fly the airplane for a while and check it again. So they signed off the annual reluctantly. The owner went and flew the airplane for an hour, brought it back, We had them recheck that cylinder hot, and it measured 72 over 80. Now, it doesn't always come out that way. I mean, that was pretty unusual. But it just goes to show you how easy it is to get a false positive on a compression check. We just don't put a lot of faith in compression checks. If we can't verify the problem with a bore scope, then we should go fly the airplane for a while and check the compression again. Okay, let's talk for a minute about when not to overhaul, and then we'll get into when to overhaul. We never ever want to overhaul an engine because of anything that involves cylinders. You need to understand that cylinders are bolt-on accessories. They're like alternators. They're like magnetos. You remove a couple of nuts, and they come off. If somebody told you that your magneto was defective and so you needed a major overhaul of the engine, that wouldn't pass the laugh test. But it's amazing how many engines go in for major overhaul because, let's say, they're burning too much oil, or the compressions are soft or something. That's nuts. Cylinders are bolt-on accessories. If there's a problem with the cylinder, we don't have to pull the engine out of the airplane. We don't have to split the case. We just unbolt the cylinder and fix it. Or if it's not fixable, we put on another one. But whatever the condition of the cylinders are, should never have any bearing on your decision to major overhaul an engine. We major overhaul an engine because of some problem in the bottom end of the engine that can't be remedied without splitting the case, like that spun bearing, or like a bad cam or something like that. We never overhaul an engine because of anything having to do with cylinders. We just fix the cylinders. But it's amazing how often owners decide to overhaul an engine because of some problem that's caused by the cylinder assemblies, even though those cylinders are easily removable. Let me talk a little about overreaction, because we see a tremendous amount of that. Never overreact to a single bad oil report. It takes at least 3 oil reports to establish which way the needle is moving. In other words, whether the problem in an oil report is a transient anomaly that's going to self-resolve, which they often do, or whether it's the start of a deteriorating trend that's going to require more aggressive forensic analysis and possibly some sort of invasive maintenance. So when we get a bad oil report back on one of our airplanes, we typically just shorten the oil change interval so that we get more data faster. And then we'll wait until we get 2 or 3 oil reports so that we can determine whether this is a problem that is self-resolving, and it's amazing how often that's the case, some kind of a transient event, or whether it's a deteriorating trend. If it's a deteriorating trend, we're still not going to tear down an engine based on an oil report, because the stuff in an oil report is telling you about microscopic particles of metal. Those microscopic particles of metal represent no safety of flight risk whatsoever. What they're doing is giving you a heads up that something is abnormal, and it's saying it's time to pull some of these other tools into play to try to figure out exactly what it is. You know, if an oil report starts showing increasing nickel, we know that that one of the exhaust valve guides is starting to wear, and that there's a likelihood that one of the exhaust valves is going to burn. Now, the oil report doesn't tell us which valve it is, which cylinder it is, but it tells us that we ought to start doing some aggressive bore scoping to try to figure out what's wrong. Similarly, if an oil report starts showing elevated steel, it's probably telling us, or elevated iron rather, it's probably telling us that there may be some cylinder barrel problem, and we need to start using the bore scope to see if we can find vertical scoring on a cylinder. Maybe there's a ring that's broken or something like that. If the oil analysis report starts showing a rising trend in copper, then we will start being concerned about bushings and bearings. But we're not going to do anything radical about it until things have gotten bad enough that we can actually start seeing some of that metal in the filter and send it out to a lab and find out exactly what it is. A little metal in a filter is quite normal. We don't ground the engine unless there's a lot of metal in the filter. Now, it turns out Continental doesn't really give any guidance on how much is too much, but Lycoming gives a lot of guidance about that. They've got pages and pages of service bulletin guidance on exactly what we're looking for in a filter. And it's pretty good guidance, and we'll use that guidance for Continentals as well, because Continental is silent on the subject. But Lycoming basically says don't ground an engine unless it's got 1/4 of a teaspoon or more of metal. And 1/4 of a teaspoon is a huge amount of metal. If you saw 1/4 of a teaspoon in your oil filter, you would rise about 1 foot off the ground. So a little bit of metal in the filter means we've got to start doing our homework. We'll probably send the metal out to a lab to find out what it is. We may start using some of these other tools to look more deeply. But we're not going to ground the engine unless there's an unacceptably large amount of metal in the filter. And Lycoming's guidance is 1/4 of a teaspoon is what that level is. Okay, what events would have to happen for us to decide that it's time to overhaul an engine? This is probably not an exhaustive list, but it's the most obvious things I could think of. So let's just go through them. We would tear down an engine if there was an unacceptably large amount of metal in the oil filter, something over 1/4 of a teaspoon, that we can't account for. And when I say that we can't account for, the example I gave you before is a perfect example. We saw thousands of flakes of bronze in the filter. We didn't immediately tear down the engine. What we did was start to take a couple of things apart to see whether any of the stuff that was easily accessible that could be generating bronze were problematic. We pulled the rocker covers, we pulled the starter adapter, and we couldn't find a problem. At that point, we said, okay, we have to tear down the engine. And it turned out that it was a good thing that we did. The second bullet, a crankcase crack beyond acceptable limits. I'll show you a picture of one of those. It actually turns out that not all crankcase cracks make the engine unairworthy. The manufacturers have service bulletins that explain what areas of the crankcase are critical and what are non-critical, and how long a crack in a non-critical area is allowed to be before the engine is considered unairworthy. Cracks in the critical area are normally considered unairworthy regardless of length. So it's fairly complicated, but an unacceptable crankcase crack is going to cause the engine to have to be torn down. A serious oil leak that can't be cured without a teardown. And there are a lot of tricks for curing oil leaks, but if the engine starts leaking oil seriously and none of the tricks work, we're going to have to tear it down. Some obviously unairworthy condition that we can observe directly with our eyes, either directly by looking at it or looking at it through borescope. A bad cam lobe that we can see when a cylinder is off, that sort of thing, or that we can see when a lifter is pulled on a Continental engine. If we see a defective cam lobe, and I'll show you a picture of one of those, that would be a reason that the engine would have to come apart. And finally, a violent event that clearly put the engine outside of its operating design limits. Most common is a prop strike. Less common, a serious overspeed, and both engine manufacturers have service bulletins that indicate how far the overspeed has to be before it requires a teardown. But that sort of event where the engine clearly was operating outside of its design parameters, that would trigger a teardown. So that's the kind of thing that would cause us to overhaul or at least do a teardown on an engine. Here are a couple of pictures of some of those kinds of things that would trigger a teardown. The upper left-hand picture is a couple of Lycoming lifters. The left one is a good lifter, the right one not so much. The right lifter is severely spalled. And unfortunately, in Lycoming engines, you can't change a lifter without splitting the case. In Continental engines, or most Continental engines, the lifters can be removed from the outside, and a lifter problem is not a big deal. For a Lycoming engine, it's a huge deal because the lifter can't be repaired or can't be replaced without tearing the engine down. The upper right picture is a picture of a bad cam lobe. We can see this kind of thing in a Lycoming engine when a cylinder is off. We can see this kind of thing in a Continental engine when a cylinder is off, or if we decide to pull a lifter to inspect the cam, which is something, for example, that we typically do on Continental pre-buys. We'll pull a bunch of lifters so that we can actually inspect the cam, because we don't want the new purchaser of the aircraft to have a $40,000 surprise because the cam was coming apart. Can't do it on a Lycoming, can do it easily on a Continental. But if you see a cam lobe like this, the engine's going to have to come apart. The lower two pictures show an unacceptable case crack. The left one is what that crack looked like to visual inspection. And as you can see, it's actually a little hard to see and quite easy to miss. The right one shows what that crack looked like after a simple dye penetrant inspection, which is what we always do to verify cracks. And you can see under the dye penetrant that this is a huge crack and a really ugly one. That engine definitely had to be torn down, and the case was rejected. It needed a new case. Just wrapping things up, just so you know, I practice what I preach. The engine's on my airplane. It's a 79 Cessna T310R. I've owned it for the last 25 years. And both engines are now at 200% of TBO. The oil filters are metal-free. The oil analysis it comes back perfect every time. The engines make full rated power. The airplane does over 200 knots with those old geriatric engines. Performance is by the book, and I have no intention of tearing them down anytime soon unless they tell me it's time. On the other hand, and this is something I've not disclosed before, the oil consumption on these engines has now risen to a point where I'm getting a little bit uncomfortable. So I've decided that it's time to try to do something about it. The oil consumption is clearly a cylinder-related issue, so in no way would influence me to do an overhaul, a major overhaul on the engine. But what I need to determine is whether this is a problem that can be resolved by changing a couple of cylinders, or whether I need to bite the bullet and do a top overhaul and change them all. Now, I should mention that 9 of the 12 cylinders on these engines are the original 1979 cylinders that went onto the airplane when it rolled out of the Cessna factory in 1979. And 9 out of those 12 cylinders have 4,700 hours on them. So they don't own me a thing. There are 3 of the cylinders that I've had to replace over the years, in each case because of a fatigue crack in a cylinder head from the top spark plug hole to the injector boss, which is where they normally crack. None of those cracks were safety of flight items. A crack of a cylinder in that area, which is where they usually crack, is basically stop drilled at both ends and isn't going anywhere. But as soon as you detect it, the cylinder has to be rejected and replaced. So over the last 25 years, I've changed 3 out of these 12 cylinders because of head cracks, and the other cylinders are the original 79 cylinders that they actually went through a major overhaul once, and they were in such good shape that the overhaul shop decided to put them right back on. And they now have 4,700 hours on them, so they're fully depreciated, let's say that. Over the last week, I spent about 3 hours going through a detailed borescope study of all 12 cylinders on my airplane. 15 to 25 images per cylinder. I have about 250 images. And tomorrow afternoon, I'm going to sit down with another senior ANPIA, a guy who I respect a great deal and who I often consult when I have serious maintenance decisions to make. And we're going to go through all these borescope images together, and I'm going to try to come to a decision as to whether there are certain of these cylinders that need to be replaced, or whether I should bite the bullet and replace all of them. They certainly have gone the distance, and they deserve to be replaced, certainly. But that's the decision that faces me over the next week or two, and that's what I'm going to be doing, using the basic philosophy that I've just shared with you. So to summarize and get into the Q&A, I recommend that you ignore TBO completely as a discredited concept, that you maintain your engine strictly on condition using all of the condition monitoring tools that we've talked about. Make sure you know how to interpret the results of those tools, or consult with somebody who does. A lot of mechanics don't really know what they're looking at through a borescope. A lot of mechanics don't really understand how to interpret oil analysis reports. Very few mechanics have a clue as to how to interpret scanning electron microscope reports on oil filter contents. But there are plenty of us who do, and we're certainly willing to help. So just make sure that you use all the tools, and that you either understand how to interpret the results or consult with somebody who does. Don't overreact to any one bad oil report, or a little metal in the filter, or one low compression result. We want to use all these tools together to make sure that we get it right. And using all those tools together, let the engine tell you when it's time. And that's all I have, Charlie. Let me just mention that Charlie is going to go through some Q&A now, but he's not going to get to all of your questions. And if you have a question that does not get answered during the Q&A session here, please feel free to drop me an email, and I will try to answer every single one of them. My email address is at the bottom of the screen, and I'll leave it up during the Q&A session. Charlie?
Boy, Mike, you're just trying to make my job so easy.
Okay.
All right, well, let's start with one.
Hey, and I got it done in an hour. How about that?
Yeah, I know. That's great. I appreciate that. And just for anybody listening, we'll probably take another 25 minutes of questions. So go ahead and get yours in now. We had at least 3 people that brought this one up, so let's just take it first, even though it was about the very end, which is, you mentioned too much oil consumption. How much is too much?
Well, that's a great question, and there are a lot of different answers to that. Let me answer the question in the context of Continental engines, because I have more familiarity with the manufacturer's guidance for Continentals than anything else. Continental really has 2 numbers that they publish with respect to oil consumption. In the type certificate data sheets of their engines, they actually specify an oil consumption formula that determines how much oil consumption is too much as an airworthiness issue. And if you work out the formula for a big bore Continental engine, and in the 300 horsepower class, the engine would actually have to be burning a little more than a quart per hour before it was unairworthy on the basis of the type certificate data sheet. Now that's an awful lot of oil consumption, and most people would not want to let their engines use that much oil before they did something. I certainly wouldn't. Just because it's not dangerous, but it's embarrassing to run out of oil before you run out of fuel. Let's put it that way. The other number that TCM publishes, which is in a service bulletin, is a quart in 3 hours. And what Continental says about that is that if oil consumption exceeds a quart in 3 hours, or 1/3 of a quart per hour, that is a level that that's the threshold where they feel that there should be concern, and that investigation should be done to determine the reason for the high oil consumption. So those are the 2 numbers that Continental publishes: a quart in 3 hours as a threshold of concern, and about a quart in 1 hour as a threshold of airworthiness. I'm not sure whether Lycoming has anything comparable to that, but those should give you a pretty good idea of where that lies. I generally say that anything from a quart in 5 hours to a quart in 20 hours is absolutely dead nuts normal, and there are a very large number of factors that affect oil consumption. But until it gets significantly worse than a quart in 5 hours, and Continental is saying a quart in 3 hours, we shouldn't be too worried about it.
Okay, and we'll start off with a comment from John. He says a local cardinal that used to fly pipeline patrol on a regular basis, 40 hours per week, put 4,000 hours on an engine with no overhauls and not even removing a cylinder. So he confirms your theory of just flying a lot.
And you know, the cardinal I'm thinking uses a Lycoming IO360, I think. The small Lycomings, the 320s and 360 Lycomings, we see them get to 4,000 hours all the time. If they're flying regularly and they don't sit around and corrode, those things are just about bulletproof.
Yes, and Rees would like to know what's the longest time you've seen an aircraft go beyond TBO?
Well, I mean, as I said, we've seen lots of small Lycomings get up to 4,000 hours or so without any problems. In terms of bigger engines, one of my Cirrus clients who flies an SR-22 with an IO550N engine, TBO on that engine is 2,000 hours. He's up to 3,200 or 3,300 hours now. Everything's doing just fine. He did pull his jugs and have a little reconditioning done. Didn't change any cylinders, but had them revalved and rehoned and put a new set of rings in, up right around 2,000 hours or so, and he's now at 32 or 33. I forget, but it's somewhere in that area and doing just fine. My engines, which are turbocharged and have a much shorter published TBO of 1,400 hours, are up at 2,800 hours right now.
Okay, well, that kind of leads me to John's question, which is how much effect does a top overhaul have in terms of putting the engine back into the infant mortality zone?
Depends on who does it. My own feeling is that if you're going to have a top overhaul, it is worth flying the airplane to an engine shop and having them do it. And the reason I say that is that I have been involved as an expert witness in a disturbingly large number of serious or fatal aircraft accidents that happened very shortly after either a top overhaul or multiple cylinder replacement. Replacing multiple cylinders, and particularly replacing all cylinders on an engine, is a very risky and invasive procedure, something that is not appreciated by most mechanics. But there have been a lot of very serious accidents that occurred right after a procedure like that. And so I'm a very strong believer in using an engine specialist to do highly invasive work like that. And in fact, if I decide that that I'm going to do a top on my airplane, which is quite possible, I will most likely get into the airplane and fly it to Power Master Engines in Tulsa and camp out in Tulsa for about a week working on the airplane along with those guys, because I frankly don't trust myself to do the work. And I do all the work on my airplane and have done for many years, but this is one where even I don't trust myself without having some expert assistance. So that should give you an idea.
Okay, and kind of on a related note, Mike would like to know if is there any data based on your infant mortality on that, based on who built or overhauled the engine, manufacturer, recognized overhaul shop, or field overhaul?
That would be wonderful data to have. Unfortunately, it doesn't exist. That is not data that we can obtain from the NTSB database. Unfortunately, the best data on this stuff is in the hands of Continental and Lycoming, and they will not share that data with anybody. It has been subpoenaed in court cases. There have been all sorts of attempts to get them to disclose the data that they have on engine failures and that sort of thing, and they absolutely refuse to do it. And I guess I can understand why. But so unfortunately, the very most complete data that exists on this subject is data that is not available to us to analyze. The best data that we do have to analyze comes from the NTSB, which is in the public domain.
Okay, and Ron would like to know, you mentioned that a borescope for under $1,000. Could you maybe throw out some models?
Actually, in my cylinder webinar, I think I went into that in some detail. I'll throw out two things. Snap-on makes a digital borescope called a BK6000. I think it's about $800, and it's a pretty good unit. The borescope that I use, which I absolutely adore, is not really a borescope at all. It's what's called a dental intraoral camera, and it's designed for dentists to take photographs of patients' teeth, and it just happens to work remarkably well as a digital borescope and a videoscope. They're very expensive if you buy them new, but I picked mine up on eBay for about $700. And anytime somebody emails me about a borescope recommendation, I usually go to eBay, and there are a couple of them for sale. So if you want more information on that, just drop me an email or go take a look at my cylinders webinar that's on the EAA site, and where I actually have pictures of the various borescopes and that sort of thing.
Okay, and then Jeff would like to know, you've mentioned the SEM analysis. Could you give them the name of some labs that do that?
Oh, scanning electron microscopy. We use Aviation Laboratories, avlab.com, avlab.com. Their offices are in Houston. Their actual laboratory is in Kenner, Louisiana, right by the New Orleans International Airport. And that's the outfit that we use for our SEM analysis. Both Lycoming and Continental also have labs. If you've got a factory engine and it's still under warranty, you can probably get analysis done by Lycoming or Continental free for nothing. If you have a non-warranty engine or one that was field overhauled, they're not interested in talking to you. We use AvLab like I say, the labs in Louisiana, and their offices are in Houston, and the web URL is avlab.com.
Okay, and Bob would like to know if there's any oil additives you agree with or could recommend.
The one aftermarket additive that we try to get all of our managed maintenance clients to use is something called ASL CamGuard. I've used it in my own airplane for about the last 5 years. It's the most effective corrosion inhibitor available, and we found it quite effective in reducing the incidence of corrosion, which, as I indicated, is probably the biggest single engine killer in the owner-flown fleet.
Okay, and Shahar has a question. An airplane didn't fly for 2 years. After 20 hours, I sent for oil analysis, and the oil analysis shows evidence of rust. Is rust required special attention, or keep flying it and change the oil and test again?
Look, anytime the aircraft is inactive for a month or two, the first oil sample you send in is always going to be sky high on iron. That's absolutely expected. There's light rust that develops on the cylinder walls. The first time you run the engine, it scrapes the rust off into the oil, and it winds up, because it's very tiny, it winds up in the jar. That's a perfect example of an oil report that wouldn't even concern me slightly. In fact, I would be shocked if the iron wasn't high under those conditions. What really matters is what the next two oil reports look like. If the iron starts coming down nice and quickly, then everything's fine. If the iron continues to go up, then you may have a problem. That's why we don't want to jump to conclusions based on any single oil analysis report. Oil analysis is a trend monitoring tool, and it takes several points in order to establish a trend.
Okay, and Sandy would like to know, typically, what is the most common cause of engine failure that occurs right after you do that overhaul? Is that in the data?
Charlie, for some reason your audio is breaking up for me. I don't know if it's at my end or your end. Would you say that again, please?
Sure. Sandy would like to know if there was a common cause of engine failure that was identified in that data that you could point to, like the most common things that cause the engine to fail right after overhaul.
Wow. I don't know what's going on here, but I only got about 1 out of every 3 words. I think what you were asking me. Can you hear me okay, by the way?
You are 5 by 5, and if anybody else is having trouble hearing me, let me know if you can hear that much. Mike,
Okay,
I tell you what, Mike, if you can hear me, I'm gonna try one thing here, and that's
you suddenly got perfect.
Oh, okay. Let me just try something. You're tech savvy enough that I'm going to try to assign a question to you just in case, and tell me if you got that.
What does that mean? Uh-oh.
We're doing this without a net, folks.
I mean, I think what you asked me, the question was, is there a most common cause of engine failure?
Correct. Right after overhaul.
Right after overhaul.
You know, the infant mortality zone. You've just had your overhaul. Is there a smoking gun, or so to speak?
There isn't any one particular one. I have to say that I mentioned that I've been involved as an expert witness in a number of cases where engines came dramatically apart. You know, right after major overhaul or right after top overhaul. I think among the ones that I have been involved in, the biggest single cause was a thrown rod, which basically means that the rod got thrown through the case, caused by one of 2 things. Most commonly by a failed rod bolt, which are there are 2 bolts that hold the rod cap onto the end of the rod where it connects to the crankshaft throw. The rod bolts are the highest stressed components in the entire engine, and they have to be torqued exactly right. And I've been involved in a couple that involved rod bolt failures, and I won't get into any further because the stories are very interesting, but they take a half an hour to tell. We ought to maybe do a webinar on them. The other cause is of catastrophic failures that I've been involved in is spun bearings, where there was a loss of torque of the through bolts holding the case halves together, and one of the main bearings shifted in its saddle to the point where the oil holes in the bearing and the oil holes in the crankcase galleries did not align anymore, and so the bearing suffered lubrication failure and caused a catastrophic engine failure. Those are, I think, the 2 most common causes that I've been involved in where there was an infant mortality failure that caused the airplane to fall out of the sky. I think that's probably the best I can do in a short amount of time, Charlie.
Okay, and by the way, most people reported that we both sound fine. We were just having trouble hearing each other, apparently.
Okay. You're perfect now.
Okay. Gene has a question. Does it help to run the engine weekly, even if you're not flying it?
Gene, it actually, for the most part, does more harm than good to do that. And the reason is that when an engine is operating, it generates a very large quantity of water. Water is one of the major byproducts of combustion, and a fair amount of water gets into the crankcase when the engine is running. And it's very important to get the oil temperature up high enough that that water vaporizes and is expelled out the breather. Typically, if you just run the engine on the ground and it doesn't get up to full operating temperature for some significant period of time, what you will be doing is generating consecutive boluses of water that will just continue to build up more and more in the oil and will aggravate corrosion issues. So I really don't recommend weekly running of the airplane on the ground. You really need to go fly it for 20 minutes, get everything up to full operating temperature. And if you can't do that, then what I recommend is pickling the engine, putting it in protective storage, which is a fairly easy process to do, and one that was discussed in my oil webinar. if you know you're not going to be able to fly the airplane for 6 months or a year or something like that, it's very easy to preserve it so that there won't be a problem.
Okay, and Mike wants to know how he would get AMT credit for this. If you are logged into the FAA system, we will post all of the attendees to the system, and the AMT credit will happen automatically. You do not need to make a request for it. Just go ahead and open an account with the FAA at FAAsafety.gov, and it'll happen automatically. Dennis's question.
The real critical thing is that the email address that you give EAA has got to match the email address you give the FAA for those things to match up.
Correct. And if you do give them the same one, it happens automatically. It's a pretty slick system. Okay, Dennis would like to know, he says, okay, so your engines are 200% of TBO. One would guess that it's due to good operating practices. Can he have your quick tips on RPM, leaning, preheating, etc. that helped you get to this point?
No. I did an entire hour-and-a-half webinar on that subject. And in fact, I think I'm going to be doing a repeat of that webinar because it was a long time ago. I'm just looking at the list here. Our webinar that's scheduled in June, on June 6th, is that leaning webinar where I will be getting into a lot of details about exactly how I manage the power plant. And I agree with you that not all, but part of the reason that I've gotten such great life out of these engines is because of careful attention to power plant management procedure. So show up in June for the webinar, or I believe the previous version of that webinar is somewhere in the bowels of the EAA video archives. But I will reveal all my secrets.
That's perfect. What a great lead-in. Stay tuned. And by the way, Mike has done some great webinars. So, he did the All About Oil. There's a lot of great ones. Just go to eaa.org/webinars, click the webinar archive button, and if you search under Bush, you'll find all of his webinars that we have on our video player.
Yeah, I think this is the 16th.
We're getting up there.
Different subject that we'll have done.
Okay, and Larry would like to know, what temp do you consider cool enough to warrant preheating before start?
Well, there's a good question. Well, like everything else, there's not really a magic number. The way I usually phrase it is that to start an engine below freezing without a preheat is a sin, and to start it below 20 Fahrenheit without a preheat is a capital offense. That's about the best I can do.
Okay, and Tom would like to know if a broken piston ring can be detected with borescope inspection.
Indirectly, yeah. If you have a broken ring, what you're going to see through the borescope very, very clearly is vertical scoring on the cylinder wall, and it'll be quite obvious under the borescope. And the vertical scoring is typically caused by a problem with the ring. You can't see the ring directly with the borescope. You can only see the ring directly after you pull the jug, but you can see but the vertical scoring on the cylinder wall will be the clue that there's a broken ring. Okay, and I'm gonna test your envelope here. I can't wait. Since you brought it up, Ernest makes the comment, there's a lot of discussion in the LSA forums about Rotex's quote-unquote requirement to overhaul an engine at 2,000 hours regardless of engine condition. What say you? Well, first of all, I have to confess a little bit of ignorance on that subject because I'm not a Rotex person. I have a friend, I'll try to make this one short, but it's funny enough to be worth telling. I have a friend who owns a STEMI motor glider that's powered by a Rotex. And I've had extensive discussions with him about this issue, and the reason is, okay, he has a motor glider, so most of the time he's flying it, the engine's shut down. He only uses it, to launch, and then he shuts the engine down. So he's now at 12 years, and he's got, I don't know, 100 hours on the engine. And the Rotex TBO calls for overhaul at 12 years, regardless of hours. Now, if I recall our discussions correctly, and please don't hold me to this because I'm doing this from vague memory, the Rotax overhaul manual or maintenance manual specifies the TBO not in the airworthiness limitation section, which means that, like most TBOs, it's simply a recommendation, not a requirement. But the STEMI maintenance manual requires compliance with the Rotax TBO, and that requirement is in the airworthiness limitation section of the STEMI maintenance manual, which makes that overhaul non-negotiable and required by regulation. And so, you know, my friend is very distraught that he's going to have to overhaul a 100-hour engine, but it looks like there's no way out of it. This is a very unusual situation because normally aircraft manufacturers write their maintenance documentation in such a way that they defer to the engine manufacturer for engine-related stuff. STEMI did not do that, and I think it was probably an inadvertent mistake on their part. But the net result is that because compliance with the Rotax TBO is written up as an airworthiness limitation in the STEMI maintenance manual, doing that overhaul at 12 years is required by regulation, and my friend doesn't have any good way out of it. Now I've told you more than I know about Rotax TBOs. Sorry about that.
Well, that's okay. You can't be an expert in everything. But I would think the philosophy is pretty much the same, you know. Well, Mike, another great webinar. Can't thank you enough for doing these things. We pretty much have a ton of questions still left. So once again, if they want their question answered, they can email you, correct?
Yes.
And then we probably should get a plug to the maintenance forum at eaforums.org. We set up that maintenance bulletin board forum.
And that's been very active, and that's a really good place to get maintenance questions answered. And I try to hang around there regularly enough, and there's a bunch of other really smart maintenance people that hang around there too.
Which is really helpful.
Yeah.
And just a reminder that 1 month from, first Wednesday of the month, next month, we have All About Batteries, March 7th.
March 7th, right. March 7th, All About Batteries, April 4th, All About Alternators, and May 2nd, All About Tires. So we're going to be covering lots of pieces and parts of airplanes. And
I'll even go forward and say that June is Leaning Basics, and August, we're skipping July, it looks like, right?
That's for AirVenture.
Yep, and August is Engine Monitors. So plan ahead, register early, and we'll look forward to hearing all about those topics. So, Mike, any last thoughts?
No. I'm glad we did have a pretty nice turnout. It was up in the 400 somewhere.
I think we broke 500.
Do you? Okay. Well, I was too busy talking to be watching, but I really appreciate the turnout at these things, and I enjoy doing them. So feel free to drop me an email on any of the maintenance issues you may have. I'm always happy to respond.
Great. Well, thank you, Mike. And I have 2 requests of our audience. One is take the survey after this ends, but number 2 is tell somebody you know that's in aviation about the webinar program, because I know that there are people out there that don't know about this excellent resource, and you would be doing them a big favor if you let them know about it. So thanks, everybody, and good night.
Good night, everybody.